Today, we're taking a look at basically the JRPG equivalent of Groundhog Day, but in this case, the game asks the real question of just how much that would mess you up, and in Stars in Time answers that with a weird mix of sugary sweet and what the heck dichotomy along the way. It touches a lot on the topics of death, loss, love, and isolation, sometimes in a comical way, other times in a welcome to Traumaville way. Now, before we dive into the review, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do ourselves. As far as how I got the game, it was through a friend, not the developer, so not your standard press key, and I'll throw a link to their channel in the description. There will also be spoilers in this review, but I'm going to place them near the end, so if you want to know about the gameplay and impressions, I'll mention a spoiler warning before we get to it, so you're safe for now. The last bit of housekeeping to do, and I hate that it has to be a thing, is to mention that this game does touch on subjects such as homosexuality, transitioning, and polyamory. And while it's not a cornerstone of this review, since my focus is on gameplay and the story itself, I will not tolerate derogatory comments about it. So if that is a problem for you, you can rant about it elsewhere. Now, jumping into the game, the spoiler-free premise is fairly simple. The game starts us on the pivotal days at the end of our team's long journey to stop an evil only known as the King. And to resolve this problem, our main character, Sifrin, is thrown into a time loop, with solutions and development happening to them from loop to loop over the course of about a 10 to 20 hour playthrough. Initially, when starting the game, I was expecting basically a roguelite RPG, though what I got was, well, a bit different. The looping mechanic is fairly thoughtfully designed, with the ability to skip dialogue through a mechanic known as zoning out, a fairly simple battle system that once you've got it down will be easy to master, and for the most part a fairly static world each time so you can adapt your reactions and learn with each loop. Starting out with the most basic part, the combat, it actually functions on a rock, paper, scissors system. Basically think conflicting elements in other RPGs, but very simplified. In standard turn-based RPG battles, of course. Rock beats scissor, scissors beats paper, and paper beats rock. This just determines the strength and weaknesses, and each character has their own native element, though you do get the ability to usually split characters into having multiple elements through either gear or just leveling up. Though gear and leveling up does work odd with the looping mechanic, as the main character, Sifrin, is the only one that keeps their experience loop to loop because they're the only one that remembers it, with the other characters only being able to lock in levels at save points, so you could grind them up and record them at a specific level if you wanted an easier time progressing, though I never felt the need to do that as the game is relatively easy, especially as Sifrin starts outpacing the levels of his allies significantly. Gear on the flip side is permanent and fairly simple, comprised of weapon, armor, and a memory. So if you unlock a new weapon for your fighter on a run, they'll have that available to equip every run afterwards. And all you'll get if you go looking for it in the spot again is a bit of dizziness as the world corrects itself to not include the item. Memories, it is worth noting, are actually gotten through interactions and achievements, and can do everything from unlocking skills to giving buffs, or in one case even debuffs, to your characters when equipped. They don't acknowledge it, so it does take some suspension of disbelief, but it is just another piece of equipment. Souvenirs and consumables, on the other hand, are not permanent, so if you want more potions on a specific round, you need to pick them up. If you want to use the souvenirs for their various functions, you need to pick them up every time. Though there are some that I never found a proper use for, but I also didn't go over every ending, so I'm writing this review after finishing 1.5 playthroughs. That said, a lot of them do have specific purposes, ranging from creating specific items to use later to unique interactions with your party, etc. So try to pick up each one at least once, which means clicking on cabinets, interacting with people, unlocking doors, etc., and exploring every nook and cranny. Now, all of this is nice, and it works well with the loop mechanic, and will even become second nature as you play, but due to the nature of the game, the vast majority of your time will actually be spent interacting with the characters, since due to infinite loops, you'll get the patterns of the tower down pretty easily and repeat them quickly, getting the items you want and ignoring the ones you don't. Most of these social interactions occur before going into the tower, as well as after each floor of the tower where you'll have snacks with your party for more dialogue. And it can take up a decent amount of time, though by zoning out, it will fast forward up to decision points to keep things moving quickly. But as it mentions when you first unlock the ability, if you don't fast forward, you might just notice small changes run to run in dialogue, especially as you begin progressing further into the story and the psychological aspect of the game starts setting in. Each loop can also unlock new options for these interactions, some positive, some negative, and even unlocking new memories for you to equip on your various characters. So, trying out alternate things can be pretty important, though judging by the achievements, I would not be surprised if there's alternate paths through the game for those that pay closer attention and avoid certain options, or on the flip side, those that pay closer attention and try to get every option possible. For me, I pretty much played along and did a bit of role-playing myself, so started out happy-go-lucky and then gave into some, but not all, of my darker thoughts as it progressed. So wager my path would fall somewhat in the neutral-ish route, but things can get pretty dark or even pretty candy sweet if you want to focus on that. That said, there are moments where your hand is forced. Things such as unavoidable deaths or loops, they're definitely there. Early on, it's mostly deaths. Later on, it's mostly forced loops to return to talk to a specific companion, since you cannot progress the story without doing so, despite being able to interact with them without looping. Thankfully, unless going for specific goals, you are fairly free to loop to wherever you want in the repeating day, including looping forward to later floors that you've already explored at least once, even being able to unlock the doors of that floor if you've already beaten it. It just takes currency known as memory of combat that you get from, well, winning fights. I do think there were missed opportunities to streamline all of this for the sake of game flow, but outside of a few of the later loops, it wasn't too obtrusive, and those, which we'll cover in the spoiler section, were more just my personal tendency to want to min-max a bit and turning out to be unnecessary. Probably the last non-spoiler thing, though, is that yes, there are optional side quests, such as finding copies of a specific book so that you can talk about it in a later loop, learning about someone's past to unlock new dialogue, finding specific items, etc. Though to get these, you have to have done the triggering event, so to get them done will boost your loop count a bit, and I highly doubt most people will do their first run in less than 50 loops, though I could see less than that being viable for speedruns or optimized walkthroughs. Now, since this is story-driven, we do need to get into spoilers to really look at it in any depth. The non-spoiler version is that I give the story a solid B+. I personally couldn't really latch into most of the characters for various reasons, with only 2 of the 5 catching my attention. But the story is there, and there will be people that identify better with each of them. I think it is outside the scope of the project, but the game would have probably been massively improved in this aspect if a certain early choice had determined interpersonal relationships a bit more, giving your not quite but almost silent protagonist a bit more agency for player connections while improving replayability. The other reason for only giving it a B+ is that while you're free to make choices loop to loop in a lot of cases, there were a handful of incidents where I felt like I was being railroaded towards a specific type of behavior, again, kicking me away from that agency, with some of them even being hardline pivots that I would not have made on my own at that point, since they were fairly sharp turns. Though, speaking of sharp turns, this is where you want to click away if you do not want spoilers. And if you plan to play this game, I would recommend playing it without spoilers. Since, while not as drastic as something like Undertale spoilers, giving away twists and turns will definitely change how you'll react to the game. Even though it does project some of this pretty hard, even early on, but you have been warned. Starting out, the story is happy-go-lucky. We start our first day interacting with our traveling companions, getting the tutorials out of the way, celebrating what will either be our last day alive or our first day of freeing the people of the continent we are on from the grip of the evil king and his time-stopping powers. We have nostalgia about the journey that happened before we got there, and we even make a passing prayer and wish along the way. There are some hints that something isn't quite right with us, mentioning our memory, the general world, etc. In our first run, we get our battle tutorial and our first unavoidable death to a rock, and no matter how much you search, you cannot avoid it. And this is doubly reinforced by the early dialogue with the only companion to loop with us through time, properly named, well, Loop, tis just a star and eyes and a weird personality, but anyway, but it is reinforced by that early dialogue with them, which is kind of just forced to talk about that rock. We of course learn run to run what will kill us, how to solve puzzles, and how to fast forward so we don't spend 30 hours just repeating the same dialogue over and over and over with small changes as our personality changes with time. In the tower, we learn about the monsters called sadness, tears that will freeze us in time and serve as an early reset method, and how to travel through the loop. We even learn about the frozen people in the tower through the stories Maribel tells us, whether she likes them, doesn't like them, as well as the past of our friends and why they behave like they do, ranging from angst against what we did during a previous journey, trying to save their lives, to someone who has trouble expressing their feelings to us and is a point of the end of every single freaking loop, it feels like. Though we're not much better in return, and that is a cornerstone of the lesson it tries to lean on. Now, we keep the looping a secret because story reasons, and I kind of wish we could experiment with telling them from the start of a loop, but I never found a way to do so. Though a certain character later on will start to notice it as we kind of do things that we shouldn't really know about, and this is reinforced by interactions in the tower giving it away and them giving us suspicious glances, but that only happens later in the story. I also somewhat wish, in kind of a related factor, we could just default lock in the answers for a certain character's ultimate skills so I don't have to keep inputting the options every loop with Bonnie, since it does let me skip the selections for all of the other characters for the weaker ultimates by zoning out. It did make the already tedious task of refreshing these abilities each run even more tedious, but that is part of me trying to min-max. You don't have to fight the king every time, so you don't need these skills every time. And each chapter we progress through, though, of which there are technically 6, changes the reactions we have slightly, so it could impact these as well, and we notice the stress leaking in. This goes not only for the town interactions, as we continually get mentioned as looking more and more stressed, more and more tired, and even at points disinterested in many things or overly blunt in others, but it also goes for our interactions on each of the rests between floors, as we unlock more dialogue options and get to try all the different snacks, even the one that kills us. We also get more and more extreme options, even so far as being able to stab ourselves for a quick reset, though it does upset our loop friend. Even though at that point we had learned that looping doesn't require death, at least on my run, so it might have been fairly late for me. Now, one unresolved thing, at least in my playthroughs, was the issue of our homeland. Sure, we can suss out what happened and find more information about it, but it weirdly feels like it leaves you hanging on that aspect. The story resolves most of its loose ends, but that just wasn't one for me on my playthrough, which I might try delving deeper into if possible on my second run. Which I should note, the game is absolutely aware that you beat it, even mentioning it at the start of your second run and unlocking the fast forward, so keep that in mind if you're going to do multiple playthroughs. That said, I found the ending loop to also be a bit odd and forced in my playthrough. Sure, we had been traumatized by the loops, but it felt like the game didn't have a good way to transition into it, so on the last loop when everything hits the fan and we alienate everyone, I really didn't like that it felt railroaded from that point. We took such a drastic turn from being kind of upset about it to just straight up asshole. And we really had no option except being an asshole, kind of like some of the early dialogue options that only have one choice, but this time in responses that didn't quite land with the character as well. I also wish we could have gotten a memory to dissolve tears, since having to re-loop a floor multiple times to get those out of the way and explore side areas did get a bit annoying to me, especially since the monster repellent memory didn't come for me until nearly the end of the game. Both would have improved the flow for me a ton, since I did get bored of the encounters by the end. I was basically one-shotting everything by loop 60, and I ended up beating this in the 80s. As far as the ending proper, I think the main character got let off a bit too easy, and while they hint at a more healthy response, it felt more hand-waved than anything, which was a disappointment due to how the game was working towards approaching trauma, though I do understand that it would be difficult to resolve in general, so maybe they just couldn't figure out a good way to write it in. Needless to say, despite the positives and the negatives, I enjoyed the game. It's really well done, especially for being an RPG Maker game. It does have its rough points, and I had a hard time connecting to a few of the characters, but I enjoyed it, and think that people looking for something in the more subversive storytelling sphere that can tolerate mental health topics would definitely enjoy it. It's an experience I can recommend. Even if it wouldn't get Game of the Year recommendation from me, I could see it getting cult classic status in some communities.